So I want to start with a quick story. The men of Kelm, pronounced, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, it's probably men of Kelm, is a Yiddish sort of collection of folk tales that represent a fictitious community in the Hebrew or the Jewish race ethnic group. It originated probably back in the 1800s, but these Kelmite stories represent sort of a humorous look at humanity, at our own human foibles. And yet, like lots of wise, foolish wisdom, there's something to it. So I'll tell it to you, and then you see if you can't find the justice in the story. So, it appears that in Kelm, there was a thief. It's a small village. When a thief strikes, it's pretty much known by everyone. And this thief had stolen from one of the members of Kelm, and he had taken any number of things, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was he was a thief. It's wrong to steal. So they searched all about the community to find this thief. They looked high and low. Everyone participated. When they finally found out who had done it, they brought the culprit before the community. And there was even a gallows ready to hang the thief. And when they saw him, it was the blacksmith. They said, the blacksmith, he stole from... Well, punish the blacksmith. Hang him. He deserves death for this horrible dude. He broke our code. And so they're beginning to take him up to the gallows when someone starts to say, wait a minute, he's our only blacksmith. If we hang the blacksmith, who's going to be our blacksmith? And at that moment, someone suddenly, eyes wide open, said, we have 2 bakers. Hang the baker. It's funny, right? But not really. Not really. Blaming the victim, is sort of a trend in retributive justice sometimes. The reality is we want someone to pay for something wrong done. And it's hard when it doesn't happen. I remember a friend of mine was going through this, and had this issue going on with a fellow staff member at his work, and worked at an advertising kind of company, and he had told me that this person probably shortcut him when he was trying to do a project and ended up getting the project for him. It was somewhat of an innocent mistake, and yet at the same time, competitiveness being what it is in the workplace. And he was pretty upset about it, and they just found themselves a wider and wider rift. And these 2 guys were pretty close. I mean, they'd been friends a long time. So there was more misunderstanding than understanding, and after a while, there was just this wide gap of bitterness that went on for maybe a couple of years. And it ate at my friend, he said. It just ate at him because they were close friends, and this person had meant a lot to them in terms of holding him up at times, when he needed it. And so he didn't know how to deal with this, except that he had really been, his trust had been broken. He felt he'd been taken advantage of. He felt he'd been abused emotionally. And then, over the holidays, he got a Christmas card. First sign of contact, first sign of communication. And it just said, I really miss our conversations, miss going out and having a beer with you, and hope you have a good holiday. It was like that. And my friend said, what do I do? And I said, go call him. Go get in touch with him. Door's open. And he said, yeah, but he didn't apologize. And so they still haven't made contact. But there's a part of us that sort of feels like, eye for an eye, right? We sort of hold on to this notion of that's justice. That's not fair for what happened. What would be fair would be for him to have asked for forgiveness, to have admitted that he did something wrong. In his book in 1947, Gandhi and Stalin, Louis Fisher published this book, and he contrasted Stalin and Gandhi as 2 archetypal figures in our society and our culture, and our global culture. And it contained a saying that mentioned Gandhi, what Gandhi is attributed to have said. It's not sure that he was the first person to say it, but this is what he wrote. He said, "The shreds of individuality cannot be sewed together by a bayonet, nor can democracy be restored according to the biblical injunction of an eye for an eye, which in the end would make everybody blind. Any attempt to introduce democracy or to check totalitarianism must constantly emphasize the rehabilitation of personality. Freedom and responsibility can help. Rigid authority can only hinder." This idea of an eye for an eye is deep in our culture. Even as Christians, even as people of faith, even as people with a spiritual base, we struggle with this notion of being wronged. Or how do we get past that? And I want us to think about this idea of future present, living in the future present. Because if anything that the Beatitudes speak to, it's not simply a clever a sort of platitude, a religious sort of platitude, but there's something that's more helpful and hopeful for our present day and for what I think ails what is basically an ingrained societal dysfunctionalism, right? It's something we seem to have trouble getting past, no matter where we are politically, no matter where we are socially, no matter where we are institutionally and religiously. We seem to have trouble getting past these notions of right and wrong to experience something much more connective, much deeper. And I think that the invitation that he's giving, that Jesus gives in these Beatitudes, is this idea of living in the future present. In his book, God's Name in Vain, Stephen Carter, who was a law professor at Yale, tells a story of Fannie Lou Hamer, a woman who was probably great at truth and justice, but not so great at politics. He writes, "This made for a revealing interaction between her and the political power brokers at the Democratic National Convention in 1964. Hamer, an African-American woman, a civil rights activist, and a devout Christian, appeared at the convention as the head of a contingent called the Freedom Democrats, who were challenging the all-white delegation representing her own home state of Mississippi. To the party brass, Fannie Lou Hamer was a puzzle and a headache. What would it take to mollify her and those that she represented? How could they sort of buy her support and get her off their backs and persuade her and her group to stop casting a pall over what was supposed to be a grand coronation of the nominee? And it terrified President Lyndon Johnson, who wanted no blot on the celebration of his nomination. So Carter writes, he sent his vice president in waiting, Hubert Humphrey, to visit her in order to figure out a way. Humphrey, believing he was undertaking a political negotiation, asked her what she wanted. What would it take? The seating of 2 delegates from her own contingent? 3, perhaps? And Hamer's reply, she didn't want anything that complicated. She said, as she told Hubert Humphrey, all she wanted was the installation of a state of affairs in which justice prevailed for the marginalized and truth rang out across the land. Or as she said, I would love to see the beginning of a new kingdom right here on earth. It's not easy, this idea of living out of the Beatitudes. And so the tendency for us is to say they're really sort of goals. They're really sort of aspirations that maybe when we get to heaven, then we'll do it. We'll be able to do it then. But Jesus saw something far deeper that all religious traditions have seen. All the great religious founders and leaders have seen this reality about humanity. We are disconnected. We are dysfunctional. And the way in which we find our connection is through opening up to one another, through risking a bit vulnerability, to begin to see ourselves in others, to begin to see the ground of our being, God as our reality, God as our holiness, as our sacredness, in one another. And that is challenging. When you look up the word justice, it actually has at its root in right relationship, in balance, which probably gave the background to why we see the scales, the scales of justice so often as a symbol. in right balance. What would that mean to live in right balance? Retributive justice seems to reinforce only a life out of balance. But the Beatitudes seem to suggest there is a way in which we can connect. The problem, of course, is that we're human, and so we deal with our two primary instinctive tendencies, right? Fear and pleasure, basically, are our most basic instincts. So we do what feels good, and we run from what frightens, or is uncomfortable, or is mysterious. And it continues to push us into these pockets of separateness, of divisiveness, of tribalism even, because we look for groups in which we can find some sort of sense of comfort, if you will. It also perhaps plays behind our most insipid cultural sort of value. Do we know what that value is? Winning. That's our most important value, is winning. We measure it in different ways. Our success at finances, our success in what we have, or our team, or who we marry, or who we associate with. We measure winning in lots of different ways, but winning and losing seem to be the great values of our culture. And what was it that Vince Lombardi said? He said, winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. He actually wasn't the first person to say that. You knew that probably. I didn't know that. It was UCLA football coach Henry Russell. Russell Red Sanders, who used that sentence a long time before Lombardi had ever said it. Did you all watch the football game this last week? How many of you watched it? Come on, raise your hand if you watched it. The Super Bowl, some of it, any of it? No? Some of you did. How many of you didn't watch it? Oh, there's hope for the world yet. Nah, I watched it too. I accidentally stepped into it. It was Linda, my wife, had been doing something, and she switched the channel. She wasn't watching it. She was on the computer, but it was playing in the background. I looked at it. I saw it. Patriots were down. It was towards the end of the second half, and Atlanta was clearly just running over them, and it was like the perfect Hallmark movie. Because you could tell this is going to turn. It has to turn. Please, God, make it turn. And before you know it, I was sitting on the couch rooting for a team I've never watched in my whole life. I've never watched either team for that matter, but it was this dynamic play of losing and winning and seeing the one who was the underdog at the moment triumph, even though the Patriots aren't, in the long picture, the underdog, but in that moment, it was this miraculous turnaround, and I got caught up in this whole idea of winning and losing. And it's not bad that we have competition, because clearly competition is good for us. Competition refines us in so many ways, but it's the idolization with winning that lies, I think, at the root of a lot of our dysfunction. Interpersonally, religious. For the several years that I've been in here as the leader of this service, I have suffered under this continuous preoccupation with how many people are in attendance. And anybody in here who has been a former clergy or retired clergy or no longer, anyone in here knows that nightmare. It's such a stupid game. And yet it's the game by which we measure. Richard Rohr has said that the great sin that we live under, Richard Rohr, the contemplative Jesuit priest, that's a Franciscan priest, lives out in New Mexico. He says that the great sin of Western civilization is capitalism. Not because money is bad, it's because we see people who don't have money as bad. It's because in the capitalist mindset, the challenge is not to measure one another's meaning or significance by virtue of their wealth or virtue of their quote-unquote success. It's a great challenge for us to move out of that reality. So in here, I constantly have to struggle with this thing of how many people are in attendance today. It's a measure of me and my success, so to speak. I'm getting over it. I'm definitely getting over it. But the reality is that it's not that it's bad. It can be good. It can encourage you. It can refine you. But the problem is that it's also, if we are only thinking about winning, we are basically thinking about life and death scenarios. The only place, as Carter writes in his book that I mentioned earlier, the only place where winning and losing really seem to be important is in life or death situations, which would primarily be war, which then begins to cast a curious shadow on exactly what are we saying when we win or lose in the context of our day-to-day routine. That those who we are winning against are our enemies. The challenge is to not see one another as enemies. And our political climate has only magnified that reality, because it is so much based on winning and losing. Walter Brueggemann has written in a number of his books that the challenge for all of our realities, whether it's political, whether it's even sports, the challenge is to see that the real team to be concerned about is humanity. That in the Old Testament, when God speaks about righteousness, God is speaking about justice. But justice has to do with right relationship. Not simply right relationship with your tribe, right relationship with creation itself. The community of God, the kingdom of God, the present, future community is all about being in relationship. And as anyone knows who's in a relationship, it's best when you are participatory in that relationship. It's best when you are active, right? When we begin to feel hurt, when we begin to feel competitive even with our partners or with our work colleagues, when we begin to feel that, we begin to separate. The relationship is coming apart. The same is true for our relationship with creation, our relationship with the world and our community. Politics only accentuates, magnifies, and shows us how much that is true. In order for the relationship to be right, we have to participate. And participation requires cooperation, requires understanding, requires attentiveness. That's why we have these Beatitudes. They're really quite simple, but they seem profoundly challenging. And we have to get past me and mine, I and you, we and they, in order to see just how simple and how profoundly transformative it is. The living in the future present is an idea that I got from this notion of not just from the biblical notion of the kingdom of God being here and now, but the Navajos used to practice this tradition, this way of thinking called the 7 generations, so that everything they did was a reflection on where they've come from and where life might go. No action was taken without giving consideration to what would essentially be their grandchildren's grandchildren, thinking 3 full generations in the future and 3 in the past, living in the present as if it was the future now. Imagine what our lives would be like if we lived that way. How much of our decision making is based on what we want now? What would it mean if our decision making was based on what we hoped the world would look like 3 generations from now? What if it was based on our belief that God's kingdom requires us to simply love, and so we just began to love, as if God's kingdom was already here? What would it mean to live in the future present? There's a magazine. I'm going to close with this article that I read from this magazine. It's called Yes Magazine. Is anybody in here ever read this magazine, Yes Magazine? Not yet? You need to check it out. It's really a positive magazine on just making differences in the world, both in your community and in the wider community. And a guy named Andrew Boyd wrote an article in the last issue, not the current one, who said, "Don't wait for a revolution." It says, "Don't wait for revolution." I'm having a hard time saying that. live it. And I believe what he's writing about is not simply a political reality. I believe what he's writing about is something that we need to understand as people of faith. We don't live as if the future is here. We live as if it can't be possible. And he writes that we can't create a better world if we haven't yet imagined it. So he does something that I want to suggest that you give some thought to over the next week. And I'm even going to invite you to write me with some ideas. He suggests that there's something that we could all do called prefigurative interventions. He bases this idea on something Buckminster Fuller said when he said, you can never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, you have to build a new model that makes the existing reality obsolete. Jesus says, blessed are those who seek righteousness. Blessed are those who show mercy. You have to change the existing reality by trying something completely that doesn't make sense, that's obsolete. Why wouldn't my friends simply just go, how wonderful, the door's open? Because what I really want is a relationship with him. So if I were living in the future as if it's present, we're having that relationship. Past is gone. Live in the present as if it's the future. So he says that's exactly what happened during the cafeteria sit-ins of the 1960s. When blacks and whites went into the cafeteria, sat down together, and for a brief moment lived as if the future were present. How many ways can we today preemptively live as if the future were present? I think there are a lot of different ways. Next week we talk about peacemaking. We wrap up this whole thing as we talk about peacemaking. So what I hope you'll do this week is I want you to think about how many ways we can live as if the future were present. Think about what it would look like if we were living in a place where you ideally, what you would envision the kingdom of God to be in the present. What would that look like? How would that mean actually living? Would that require a change a little bit? Would it require an adjustment of attitude? Would it require seeing that person that we found as really hateful or spiteful, seeing him simply as a murky pool of water that if we could pull away a little bit of the stuff on the surface, we'd see the clear water underneath, and they're just the same. They long to be connected as much as we do. They long for fresh water as much as we do. Would it require simply stepping past some of our anxieties and living as if the future were now present?